You may.
May it please the court, Mr. Fuentes, Mr. Striegel, or Ms. Striegel, members of the jury. 23 stab wounds from a Phillips head screwdriver. 17 stab wounds from a knife. Multiple blunt force injuries inflicted from a baseball bat. On the late night of March 13th, 2024, or perhaps early morning of March 14th, 2024, that's how Taylor Escontrias died. The evidence the state will present over the course of this trial will point to one individual as the individual that inflicted all of those fatal blows, that being the defendant, Christopher Behal. The investigation started as a relatively routine drunk driving investigation. At 1:42 a.m. on March 14th, near the intersection of East Harrison and 90th Street, I think it's East 90th and Harrison, near the Mount Joy Airport, a Chevy Impala driven by the defendant struck a light pole. You'll see the exact moment that happened from a security camera from a nearby weather station. You won't see the accident happen directly, but you will see the light that was on, and then the lights off at 1:42 in the morning. You'll hear from Lieutenant Leonard with the Scott County Sheriff's Office, who was the first person to arrive on scene. You hear about his descriptions of the defendant and the crash scene itself, and how, in his mind, at that point, he was investigating a drunk driving accident. Also arriving on scene is Deputy Jacob Turner, as well as medics Paul Tucker and Carly Schoenthaler. You'll hear for sure from Deputy Turner and Paul Tucker, again, their observations on the scene regarding the defendant being intoxicated. And importantly for our discussion is you'll hear from Lieutenant Leonard, about he recovered a knife from the floorboard of the vehicle the defendant was driving. He removed the knife for his safety. People carry around pocket knives, didn't think much of it. Lieutenant Leonard at that time didn't know that Taylor Escontrias' blood was on the blade of that knife from being stabbed with it shortly before that accident. Medics attended to the defendant, took him by ambulance to Genesis Hospital. Deputy Turner followed the ambulance and is again investigating an OWI, or operating while intoxicated, case. Through the course of that investigation, the defendant asked if someone can check on his girlfriend, Taylor Escontrias, at their shared apartment in Parkview. Deputy Turner relays that information. You'll hear from Deputy James Raby. He actually goes to that apartment and knocks on the door to check on Taylor. At this point, law enforcement has no idea what's going on. Deputy Raby has no idea that Taylor's body lied just a few inches on the other side of that door that he was knocking on. That information is relayed again to Deputy Turner, still investigating the OWI at the hospital, who relays that information to the defendant. And you'll see a lot of this interaction through body cam. Once hearing that information, statements from the defendant become more sinister. He tells Deputy Turner that he is having visions of beating Taylor with a baseball bat. And he'll expound on that, and again, you'll see a lot of that interaction yourself. At this point, Deputy Turner is more concerned. This is more than just a routine welfare check. He is legitimately concerned for Taylor's safety. He again relays that information to Lieutenant Leonard, who then sends another deputy, Deputy Landon Slagle. And I think around 4 in the morning, I don't remember the exact time, Deputy Slagle goes to the same door that Deputy Raby had knocked on a few hours earlier. He knocks on the door, again, gets no response. The difference is he opens that door and finds Taylor's body laying just inside of it. Deputy Slagle clears the apartment to make sure there's no other individuals injured there, and also to make sure that whoever did this wasn't present. He secures the apartment, or clears the apartment, and then secures it so a search warrant can be obtained. You're going to see a lot of horrible and bloody photos from that apartment. We will try to keep them. We're not going to show you the photos for shock value, but there's no way around that you're going to see a lot of those photos. And a lot of those are going to be introduced through Deputy Alex Grease, who documented a lot of the scene. Those photos will document the brutal nature of this crime. It'll also show how the altercation moved about the apartment. We're not just talking about one location from the apartment. You're going to hear from State Medical Examiner Dennis Klein, Dr. Dennis Klein, also the County Medical Examiner, Dr. Barbara Hardy. Dr. Hardy's testimony will be relatively brief, but she'll explain the duties of a medical examiner. Essentially, that she investigates any unnatural death, and she'll explain the details of that. She arrived on scene the next morning, determined that this was clearly an unnatural death, and then ordered the body to have an autopsy done, which happened in Ankeny, Iowa, with Dr. Klein. Dr. Klein's going to testify about the injuries he observed on that autopsy. That would be the 23 screwdriver wounds, 17 knife wounds, and the multiple blunt force wounds. He's going to talk about those. He's going to tell you that as a result of those injuries, that Taylor lost her life, that she died. He won't be able to tell you exactly which injury caused that death, but taken as a whole, one or more or all of them caused Taylor to die that evening. You're also going to hear a lot from Deputy Ethan Rolling. At the time this happened, Deputy Rolling was a detective, and he was the lead detective for this case. He'll tell you how he arrived on scene. Again, I forget the exact time, but it was fairly early that morning once they figured out what was going on and that this was a homicide investigation. He arrived on scene in Parkview, took a brief walk around the scene to familiarize himself with that, and then later that morning interviewed the defendant. And you're going to see a lot of that interview to hear the defendant give you his side of the story about what happened. You'll hear a couple different stories from the defendant in that interview, at least one of which he acknowledges isn't correct. And again, you'll see that. You'll hear the defendant tell Deputy Rolling that he remembers beating Taylor with a baseball bat, even going so far as to demonstrate the chopping motion that he used to do that. He admits that he stabbed her. You'll hear him admit or not recall a screwdriver injury, but at least the wounds with the bat and the knife, you will hear the defendant recall using those against her. You'll also hear the defendant qualify a lot of those statements. He'll admit something and then say that he really doesn't remember or something like that. Moving on, Detective Rolling obtained a DNA sample from, it's called a buccal swab, from the inside of the defendant's cheek, and he also swabbed his hands. That was sent to the DCI lab, and you're going to hear from the criminalist, Stanton Freilinger, that tested those samples. You're going to hear from, he tested a lot of samples, not everything, but a lot of samples. I mentioned Taylor's blood and DNA was found on the knife that Lieutenant Leonard found. It'll be Mr. Freilinger that's going to tell you that that was Taylor's DNA and Taylor's blood on that knife. He's also going to tell you that Taylor's blood was found on the defendant's hand from the swab that Deputy Rolling took. He'll also tell you that Taylor's DNA and blood was found on clothing that the defendant was wearing. There's not a lot of blood on the clothing, but there is blood on the clothing that the defendant was wearing when he went to the hospital that evening. At the conclusion of this case, I'm going to talk to you again in closing arguments. When I do that, I'm going to ask you to return a verdict of guilty to both counts, murder in the first degree and domestic abuse assault with intent to inflict serious injury. Thank you.
The defense.